Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a live stream here on the Buddhist Insights at Empty Cloud channel. I'm hosting the live stream here from Italy, and so anyone who's watching this later on or watching this live, you'll be tuning into the US channel. And so if you're new, you might not be familiar with me, but I'm one of the monastics connected to Empty Cloud staying in Italy. And I hope that you're all doing well. I hope that whether you're watching this live, and I see some of you already tuning in, hello to you. And whether you're watching this later on, welcome, and hope you're doing well. And so we might as well go ahead and get started. I'll give a brief introduction to the topic, and then we can render homage to the Buddha and start the formal talk. So what I wanted to look at today was mindfulness, as the title says, mindfulness for everyday life. And specifically looking at what the suttas say about mindfulness and how that might be similar or different to modern ideas of mindfulness, and specifically in daily life. Though, of course, we'll touch a little bit on mindfulness in general. But that's kind of the main topic, and the focus is going to be on the suttas, so on the early discourses that we see where the Buddha is talking to his disciples, or we see disciples of the Buddha practicing in certain ways. So that's the topic, and at this point we can go ahead and render homage to the Buddha in the traditional way, and the reason why we're gathered here today, and the reason why we can look at the suttas and talk about his teachings. And then I'll give a little bit of a talk, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to write those while I'm speaking, and I might address them during or I might address them after, but try to leave time so that everyone who asks a question has the opportunity to receive a reply. Okay, so let's go ahead and render homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. All right. And I see someone has a question about what the topic is, which I just discussed. So hopefully that will become clear if it hasn't already. So we're going to be talking about mindfulness, and just a few words of introduction, because I've selected some suttas, and I'll put these in the comments, and then maybe later on these can be edited into the description of the video. So anyone watching later can also access them easily, or if you want to reference this in the future. And so a few words. So when we talk about mindfulness, I think this is a word that all of us will have heard. And interestingly, even if you don't speak English, so in Italian, they have a word, la mindfulness, which means mindfulness in Italian. There's also a word, la consapevolezza, which is another translation of mindfulness. But the English word mindfulness has become cross-cultural, I think. And it's almost like as if it were trademarked in a way, as if it were a sort of brand. And thankfully, that's not yet happened, and I don't think that's possible. But I'm sure it would happen if it were possible. So let's all hope that doesn't happen. And so mindfulness has become quite well known and quite popular, and I think for good reason, right? Because when we talk about mindfulness, however we might understand that, it's usually coming from a desire to practice some kind of spiritual tradition, some kind of more inward-looking reflection or contemplative introspection, right? So something that kind of gets us more in touch with our impulses and our emotions and life and what's happening, instead of just being kind of lost and consumed in the flurry of busyness and turmoil that we might experience, either inside or out. And so I think mindfulness is popular, and for a good reason. But sometimes when things become popular, then of course they can be diluted, or the meaning of them can be simplified or even changed in potentially harmful ways, right? And this is a topic that's been discussed quite a fair bit. There are even books written on it. I think one is called something like Mick Mindfulness or something like that. I can't remember exactly the title of the book or the author, but I'm sure if you looked that on the internet, you'd be able to find more than one book and, many papers and so on, even in secular circles, looking at, well, is this idea of mindfulness, is this really the full picture, right? Have we understood the word mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness in its full kind of potential, so to speak? And mindfulness, in my understanding of it, and I believe that this is quite well known, the modern practice of mindfulness found in even things like therapy, right? Certain forms of psychotherapy and Western based therapies based off of the, things like we have therapists and psychologists famous in the West, like Sigmund Freud, and then we have evolutions and variations and changes in the way that we think about therapy. And nowadays it's common that mindfulness is included in certain therapies with people who aren't Buddhist, right, at all, per se. And then you have also mindfulness included in maybe schools or education programs and all kinds of different settings. And then you also have mindfulness in Buddhist circles, right? So then you have mindfulness where you're taught mindfulness in monasteries or in retreat centers, or you're taught mindfulness by lay teachers who are teaching Buddhism. So you're taught mindfulness in also Buddhist setting and other religious settings. So the word mindfulness is just so broad, right? It's both like it's used in Buddhist circles, it's used in secular circles, it's even used in, I'm sure, Christian circles, right? Mindfulness in Christianity, mindfulness in Islam, mindfulness and so on. And I imagine also Hinduism, though I'm not quite sure because I don't know if they really need to borrow the concept from Buddhism. I imagine they probably already have something similar, since, as we'll discuss, mindfulness comes from a translation of an Indian word. So, so what are we talking about? And so what we're going to look at here is mindfulness as it's kind of practiced in the early discourses of the Buddha. And many of you will already be familiar with this, but it's also good to make sure everyone has some kind of idea, and it could also be a refresher to say, okay, well, what are the early discourses of the Buddha? What are we talking about there, right? And so before I go into the details of that, I can kind of trace back why we're looking at the discourses of the Buddha. And the reason is the word mindfulness, as I said, as I just referenced briefly before, is a translation of an Indian word, right? So mindfulness the word comes from a translation. It's not a sort of, it's not like mindfulness existed in the sense that we use it today. It's a new use of the word. Maybe this is the best way of saying it, right? So if you look back like 100 years, 200 years, and you start looking at, well, where were the mindfulness centers, right? Where were the mindfulness-based therapies? Where were the mindfulness, certificates? They didn't really exist, basically, because mindfulness is a sort of a modern phenomena in the sort of broad sense of the term mindfulness, right? The one I'm talking about now, where it's like practiced across the board by different people. That sense of mindfulness is a sort of modern phenomena. And it comes from, the word mindfulness comes from a translation. I believe this was done by Thomas Rice Davids. I haven't studied the history of it in detail, but I'm almost 100% certain that it was an early PTS translation. So PTS means Pali Text Society. And this was a kind of society where they focused on translating Pali texts. And in the Pali texts, which are a corpus of religious literature that I'll get to, in the Pali text, there's a word, which is sati. And so sati was translated as mindfulness. And then that went on to be used in the modern sense of mindfulness that we know today. So where is this coming from, right? Well, as many will be familiar, the Pali texts include things like the suttas, right? The Pali suttas within what's called the Pali canon. And these are early discourses, early teachings, early narratives that relate the accounts, events and teachings that happened during the time of the Buddha, specifically the life of the Buddha, and then shortly after his life mostly. So within a period of maybe 100, sometimes maybe 2 or so years. Sometimes it's said that it's the period about basically before King Ashoka, like pre-Ashokan Buddhism. So the suttas that we find in Pali, they're kind of representing a period of Buddhism in the very earliest days. And most of these are happening, they're set, and they're probably go back to very, very close to the actual time of the Buddha himself, or the Buddha himself teaching these things and his disciples remembering, organizing them, and so on, right? And so if we want to understand what the Buddha taught, the historical Buddha, then these are a really primary source. And we also have parallels of these in Chinese that are often known as the Agamas. And then we have parallels in Sanskrit, and we have parallels in many other languages, including things like Uyghur and Tibetan and all kinds of languages. And these are recensions, like lineages of the teachings of the Buddha, right? So this isn't a kind of a comprehensive review of it. I apologize if it's not the most clear for who might be less familiar. I don't think that I can give a comprehensive review at this time because it's not the main topic. But the point is that we have lineages, transmissions of teachings of the Buddha that then are passed down in different languages. And one of those languages is Pali, and it's the main canonical language of Theravada Buddhism. And it's the language in which we find the texts, right, the teachings of the Buddha in Theravada circles, Theravada communities. Right? And it's the Pali texts are special because they are the only complete collection of early teachings of the Buddha that we have. So like I said, we have parallels in Chinese, but the parallels in Chinese come from, maybe a better way of wording it, I apologize, a better way of wording it would be the Pali texts are the only complete collection from a single school that we have. So like if you look at a sutta, like we'll look at some suttas today, right? Some of these suttas, they have parallels. You can find them in Chinese. You can find them in Sanskrit. You can find them in many other, languages. And they're not just translations of the same text. They're actually like separate lineages of a teaching from the Buddha. So imagine that, you hear this and then you go tell your friend about it and someone else hears it and they tell their friend about it. And then 1,000 years later, we compare the lineage, a friend told their child, told their child, told their child, told their child. And then 1,000 years later, we compare one side of the world and another side of the world, and they're both telling the same story. And it turns out that it comes back from the same source. Like it comes back from a teaching that that their ancestors both heard and passed down, right? So that helps authenticate it. It helps us know, like, oh, this is probably coming from a common source because, you have large distances of land and vast expanses of time where people are telling basically the identical thing in different languages. And so the teachings of the Buddha, they've been passed down in different lineages, and they often are matched often almost identically in many scenarios. But the Pali Suttas are unique because they have an entire collection. So the whole corpus of what the tradition collected of the Buddha's teachings, of his early teachings, the whole corpus, all from a single school in a single language. Whereas in Chinese, for example, you have like parallels of a section, and you have all of the sections, or many of the sections, but from different schools. So yeah, I hope that this isn't too confusing, but my main point here, if all that is maybe a bit, if it's a bit too much, my main point here is that the Pali Suttas are a kind of very special collection of early teachings from the Buddha. And in those suttas, that's where we find the word that's translated as mindfulness. So if we want to understand, like, where does mindfulness come from, then looking at the Pali Suttas, looking at the discourses of the Buddha in the Pali Canon is a really good place to look, right? Because that's where the translation comes from. And it comes from the teachings of the Buddha, and a great source for the teachings of the Buddha is the Pali Canon. That's sort of a kind of a chaotic explanation of why we would look here. And the word that's translated as mindfulness in Pali is sati. Sati. And this is a word that is also parallel or cognate with the Sanskrit word smrti, right? Which some people will know the Sanskrit more than the Pali, maybe. And so this word sati in Sanskrit smrti is then translated as mindfulness, and then it goes on to be taught in a variety of ways. And sometimes when we think about the word mindfulness and we think about how it's taught in everyday life, right? We might think, okay, just be mindful. So be mindful while you're walking, be mindful while you're doing the dishes, right? It's a very common example. Be mindful while you're driving, be mindful while you're speaking, and be mindful while you're going about your day, and just every activity that you do, be mindful, right? Just be mindful. So it's a teaching that you might hear, be mindful, develop mindfulness. Or you have things like mindfulness practices to reduce chronic pain or to help cope with chronic pain, or mindfulness practices to deal with stress and anxiety and so on. So it's mindfulness, right? Now, is that what the Buddha was saying? Is that what the word sati, or is that in Pali? Is that how it's used? Is that what the Buddha was teaching? Right? Is that when we get this word mindfulness that's supposed to be coming from the Buddha? Is that what it means? Is that what was the Buddha saying about it? And that's what I'm going to be looking at. So, one thing I haven't prepared this talk, as you probably know, so I apologize again if it's sort of all over the place. But one thing that is good to keep in mind, and I believe I read this at one point from Bhante Analayo. He's a monk ordained in the Theravada tradition who does a lot of research on Pali and Chinese texts and early Buddhism. And I believe one of the things he said was that basically it's important to understand that nowadays when we talk about mindfulness, really there's like a variety of things that we're talking about, and we're using the same word, but actually it's not just one thing. And that's exactly what we're going to look at today. It'll be a similar conclusion. Surprise, spoiler alert, that we will say that actually the Buddha had different things to say about mindfulness. But just because it's important to understand, like just because we use the word mindfulness in different ways doesn't mean it's wrong to do something else, right? Like if I call something a tomato and you call it a tomato, well, that doesn't mean that what you're calling a tomato is like morally wrong or something, right? You just have a different name for it. So in the same way, we can say, well, if I call something, I call this, let's say I call, tomatoes fruit and you call tomatoes vegetables. Well, we call it by different names, but it's the same thing. So names doesn't necessarily match to reality, right? The same name can be different realities, or different names can be the same reality. So names and reality don't necessarily match one-to-one. So it's important to understand that. So when we say like, oh, mindfulness is used in these different senses, and the word mindfulness isn't necessarily used how the Buddha used the word, equivalent of the word, that doesn't mean that the other practices are wrong or something, right? We can't just dismiss them because they use the word differently. But instead, we can just see, well, if we're interested in what the Buddha said, then we can look at what he said and we can compare it, right? So it's important to say that, like, not to get sort of a conceit of superiority if we think like, oh, well, the Buddha used the concept in a different way, so everyone else is wrong. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? Just because the word is used differently doesn't mean everyone else is wrong. It just means the word is used differently. So it's important to understand that. Okay, so as I said, so how did the Buddha use the word mindfulness, right? How is it different, right? Well, one thing to say right off the bat is, as you probably have gathered, the Buddha never said the word mindfulness because he didn't speak English, right? So he never used the word mindfulness. So that's for sure, basically. We can pretty much be certain that the Buddha never used the word mindfulness. But he probably used a word like sati or smrti, right? The word that I mentioned that's translated as mindfulness. And so we can look at what he said about that. And there's some interesting suttas where the Buddha is talking to lay people, or you even see lay people practicing certain things that kind of help shed light on what was practiced as mindfulness, what was understood in the early Buddhist community. So you have like direct teachings from the Buddha, right? But you also have just what were people actually doing, which can also be very interesting, which sometimes we might overlook. And that's one of the first suttas I want to look at. There's a really interesting sutta that I think is not taught almost ever, but it's really interesting, and especially for a certain aspect of it, which is like it's almost like a side detail in the sutta. It's not really the main point of the sutta, but it's a really interesting detail because it kind of sheds light on what were lay people who were Buddhists, lay Buddhists in ancient India in the time of the Buddha. What were they doing? Like, what was their practice, right? What was their daily practice? Which I think is really relevant for a lot of the people who will be listening, right? A lot of you are lay people, if not all of you. And so it's kind of interesting, like, what were the lay people in the time of the Buddha doing, right? And we'll see that relates to the word mindfulness. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take a look at this sutta, and it doesn't directly mention the word mindfulness, but we'll talk about how it actually is a practice of mindfulness. And so this is Udana 2.8. I'm going to put a link to it here, with the translation I'll be reading from. And so the Udana is a collection which has prose and it also has verse combined, and it tells stories where the Buddha is relating to people and giving teachings or similar things. And then it closes with a verse. So this is from the Udana. It's a collection of Buddhist teachings. And this is called the Supavasa Sutta. So the discourse with Supavasa, and Supavasa is the name of a lay woman. So it's a lay practitioner in the time of the Buddha. And she's kind of the protagonist, so to speak, of the sutta here. So here's how it goes. Here's this sutta in Bhante Sujato's translation. So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Kundiya in the Kundadhana Grove. Now at that time, Supavasa the Kolian had been pregnant for 7 years and in obstructed labor for 7 days. Okay, we just pause here. You might be thinking she was in labor, she was pregnant for 7 years. So we're already starting off with something that might seem a little bit weird, but just bear with the sutta. It's not actually that relevant, but I will just pause there because it might be like, wait a minute, 7 years pregnant. So she's having something strange going on here. Something that is not probably very pleasant, as we'll see. And so she's been pregnant for 7 years and in obstructed labor for 7 days. So 7 days she's been, going through a hard time. And then it says, while suffering painful, sharp, severe, acute feelings, 3 thoughts helped her endure. Oh, the Blessed One is indeed a fully awakened Buddha who teaches the Dhamma for giving up suffering such as this. Oh, the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is indeed practicing well, who practice for giving up suffering such as this. Oh, extinguishment is so very blissful, where such suffering as this is not found. Then Supavasa addressed her husband. Please, Master, go to the Buddha, and in my name bow with your head to his feet. Ask him if he is healthy and well, nimble, strong, and living comfortably. And then say, Supavasa the Kolian has been pregnant for 7 years and in obstructed labor for 7 days. While suffering painful, sharp, severe, acute feelings, 3 thoughts help her endure. Oh, the Blessed One is indeed a fully awakened Buddha who teaches the Dhamma for giving up suffering such as this. Oh, the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is indeed practicing well, who practice for giving up suffering such as this. Oh, extinguishment is so very blissful, where such suffering as this is not found. Excellent idea, he replied, it's her husband. He went to the Buddha and told him of his wife's struggles. The Buddha said, May Supavasa the Kolian be happy and healthy. May she give birth to a healthy child. As soon as he spoke, Supavasa, happy and healthy, gave birth to a healthy child. Saying, yes, sir, the Kolian gentleman approved and agreed with what the Buddha said. He got up from his seat, bowed, and respectfully circled the Buddha, keeping him on his right. Then he returned to his own house. He saw that his wife, happy and healthy, had given birth to a healthy child and thought, Oh Lord, how incredible, how amazing. The realized one has such psychic power and might, for as soon as he spoke, Supavasa, happy and healthy, gave birth to a healthy child. He became uplifted and overjoyed, full of rapture and happiness. Okay, so I'm going to pause there because the rest of the sutta is actually not particularly relevant to this talk, although it's actually a really interesting sutta. So I recommend you read it because it's quite, as you already have gathered, it has some interesting things going on there. And it ends in an interesting way where I won't tell you. So if you want to find out how it ends and how it goes, you have to read the rest of the sutta. So that's a very interesting sutta in and of itself. It's just, I recommend that. But and the main point of the sutta is actually basically about how we can go through intense suffering, and then it's really about suffering. It's not about everything I just read is kind of like the setup to the sutta. It's basically just the introduction. So it's not about what I just read is not really directly relevant to the main message. So why did I stop there? Well, the reason I just read that is because what's interesting about this sutta is what is Supavasa doing, right? So she's going through this hard time. Like supposedly she's been pregnant for 7 years, and then for 7 days she's been in painful labor. And it says that what she was doing, what she was practicing, was she was remembering, like, to console herself. She was thinking, oh, I'll just read it exactly what it says. It says, oh, the Blessed One is indeed a fully awakened Buddha who teaches the Dhamma for giving up suffering such as this. So what is the suffering? So she's thinking, she's going through this intense suffering, like the painful labor. And she's thinking, oh, the Buddha he is a fully awakened Buddha, and he teaches the Dhamma precisely so that this suffering can be overcome. And then she thinks, oh, the Sangha of the Buddha's disciples is indeed practicing well, who practice for giving up suffering such as this. So then she's being consoled, thinking like, I'm going through this hard suffering, but the Buddha became fully awakened and taught the Dhamma so that we can overcome this suffering like this. And the Sangha, the Buddha has disciples who are practicing well so that they can overcome suffering such as this. And he says, oh, extinguishment, that's Nibbana. So, oh, Nibbana is so very blissful, where such suffering as this is not found. So then she's thinking, oh, there is such a thing as the ending of suffering, the extinguishment of all this suffering. So that's actually her practice. Like while she's going through this labor, was she practicing? She was practicing mindfulness to overcome the pain, but in a very different way from what you might find in like a secular setting, right? So nowadays, if you like, let's say someone is in the hospital, they actually do this, from my understanding. Like people in the hospital, they will actually teach them mindfulness, where they feel the pain and they kind of develop a separation from the pain and kind of accept it as it is and they use mindfulness so that the pain doesn't overwhelm their mind. Now, what's very interesting is that we have actually an ancient example of that, but it is a very different form of mindfulness, right? Supavasa, it's not like she's developing awareness and wisdom of, say, like the impermanence of the feeling or something like that. It's kind of related, right? It's not completely separate. But what she's actually doing is she's remembering, oh, the Buddha was awakened. The Buddha is awakened, and he realized the way to get out of this suffering. And that gives her this comfort, like, oh, there is this awakened being in the world who, out of compassion, taught the way to be free of this suffering. And then she thinks, oh, there are actually disciples of the Buddha, and they're actually practicing to be free of this suffering, right? And oh, Nibbana, there is such a thing as the extinguishment of this suffering. There is a way out. So that's actually the mindfulness that she's practicing, which is like, wow, that's very fascinating, right? That's what and the thing is that the Buddha doesn't actually teach this. There's never a sutta where the Buddha says, like, if you're going through intense pain, you should think, oh, Nibbana is so blissful because that's where such suffering as painful labor doesn't exist. He never says that. But what you see is that you have a disciple of the Buddha practicing that. So that's an interesting thing already. Like, oh, that's very fascinating, right? And does the Buddha teach similar things, though? Is just, should we do that? Is that something that is recommended? Because he doesn't teach it. She's just doing it. And that's where we look at other suttas. And that's where we can see that what Supavasa, the laywoman, what she is doing is actually a form of mindfulness. And it is a form of mindfulness that the Buddha recommended, especially to lay people, but also monastics. So the next sutta I want to look at, because we're building a theme here, is the sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya with Mahanama. So this is Anguttara Nikaya 11.12, and it's a sutta with Mahanama, who is another layperson. So Mahanama was a layman. He's said to be a Sakyan, so he would have been from the Buddha's own kind of clan and people. And I'll read just part of the sutta here. So, at one time, the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans, near Kapilavatthu in the Banyan Tree Monastery. Now at that time, Mahanama the Sakyan had recently recovered from an illness. At that time, several mendicants were making a robe for the Buddha, and Mahanama the Sakyan heard about this. He went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, "Sir, I have heard that several mendicants are making a robe for the Buddha, thinking that when his robe was finished and the 3 months of the rain's residence had passed, the Buddha would set out wandering. Now, we spend our life in various ways. Which of these should we practice?" So just for context, I think what we should gather from the introduction here is that basically you have a layperson, right? The Buddha's staying in the area, and you have a layperson who is sick, so he probably wasn't able to visit the Buddha. And then he hears that the monks are making a robe and that the Buddha is going to leave soon. So once the robe is ready and the retreat is over, the Buddha is going to leave. So Mahanama decides, okay, the Buddha is going to be leaving soon. How about I go pay him a visit? So the layperson, he goes and he visits the Buddha. And then he asks him, right, we spend our life in various ways. Which of these should we practice? So he's asking the Buddha, how should I practice the Dhamma in my daily life? That's basically that's exactly what he's saying right here, right? We do many different types of things. How should we practice? Like, what should we be doing? And so very relevant question, right? And the Buddha also thought it was a relevant question because he says, Sadhu, sadhu, Mahanama. Good, good, Mahanama. It's appropriate that gentlemen such as you come to me and ask, we spend our life in various ways. Which of these should we practice? Right? So the Buddha there, he's just saying, hey, that's great. You should be asking me that. What should you be doing in daily life? And then the Buddha tells him, he gives him a teaching. The faithful succeed, not the faithless. The energetic succeed, not the lazy. The mindful succeed, not the unmindful. Those with samadhi succeed, not those without samadhi. And the wise succeed, not the people without wisdom. When you're grounded on these 5 things, go on to develop 6 further things. Firstly, you should recollect the realized one. That's the Tathagata, which is the Buddha. That blessed one is perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those fit for training, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed. When a noble disciple recollects the realized one, their mind is not full of greed, hate, or delusion. At that time, their mind is quite unswerving, based on the realized one. A noble disciple whose mind is unswerving finds inspiration in the meaning and the teaching, and finds joy connected with the teaching. When they're joyful, rapture springs up. When the mind is full of rapture, the body becomes tranquil. When the body is tranquil, they feel bliss. And when they're blissful, their mind becomes collected in samadhi. You should develop this recollection of the Buddha while walking, standing, sitting, lying down, while working, and while at home with your children. So I'll pause there and just briefly summarize the rest, because that formula that we just went through, the Buddha just repeats it basically over and over again, but he does it with a couple different topics. So 1, recollecting the Buddha. 2, recollecting the Dhamma, the teaching. 3, recollecting the Sangha, the Buddha's disciples. 4, recollecting your own sila, your own virtue and ethical conduct. 5, recollecting your own generosity. And then 6, recollecting that you have the same qualities as the angels, the devas. And then he says, you should develop that recollection of the deities while walking, standing, sitting, lying down, while working, and while at home with your children. And that's the sutta. So very interesting for a couple of different reasons, which you might miss in the English translation. Because you might already know where I'm going with this, right? The Buddha just said right there, when you're walking, standing, when you're working, when you're with your children, what should you be doing? You should be remembering the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and other topics, right? So, for example, the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which is exactly what we just saw the lay disciple Supavasa was doing when she was in childbirth, right? She was recollecting the Buddha and Dhamma and Sangha. And that was what was that was the mindfulness that helped her get over the pain. And then here a layperson comes and asks the Buddha, what should we do in our everyday life? And the Buddha says, basically, he gives a teaching, and then part of that teaching is you should recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in your everyday life, including while you're with your children and when you're working. So what's interesting, though, that you might miss, like that's already should be relatively clear, but the word for recollect and the word for mindfulness are based on the exact same word. So the word, when the Buddha first starts this teaching, he says, what's translated in English, he says, the mindful succeed, not the unmindful. So what he's saying there is, the Pali word is upattitasati, I believe. He says, yeah, upattitasati. So that means someone who has established mindfulness, basically. Someone who has established sati. And then he says, for example, you should recollect the Buddha. But the word for to recollect is also based off the word sati. And then when he says, this recollection of the Buddha, the word for recollection of the Buddha is buddhanussati. So it's also related to the word sati. So the word sati in Pali and in Sanskrit, which I said before, and it's quite well known, so many of you may have already known this, but the word sati, usually translated as mindfulness, it actually means memory. Very literally, it means memory. And that's very relevant to the meaning of the word. So memory might sound very different from mindfulness, right? If we think mindfulness is like present moment awareness, but then the Buddha, the word sati means memory. So how does that fit together? And here you get an example of that. So sati means memory, not in the sense of like, oh, I remember when I was a child and it was so pleasant, being on the beach or something like that. That's not per se. I mean, it can mean that in like a secular setting, but when the Buddha uses the word sati, he's actually talking about something specific. It's the ability to keep something in mind. And so it's the keeping in mind. I think that probably the best translation of sati, like if you were to kind of give it a phrase, would be keeping in mind. So we say that in English, right? Keep it in mind. That means hold it in your mind. It means remember it. So if I say like, remember to lock the door when you leave the house. So what that means is like, you need to keep that information present in your awareness when you're leaving so that you actually do the task, right? Or if I say like, remember that, we're going to be leaving at 5 p.m. or something like that. Okay. So then the awareness of leaving at 5 p.m. should be somewhere in your mind. Like you should be maintaining that information somewhere in your mind, right? So the Buddha says, remember the Buddha. Like while you're walking, while you're standing, while you're working, while you're with your children, remember the Buddha. Remember the Dhamma and so on. That's what he means. That means practice mindfulness of the Buddha. It means remember it. Keep the awareness of the Buddha in the sense of the qualities of the Buddha. Keep the awareness, like remember those qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha while you're doing these different activities, exactly as the laywoman Supavasa was doing. So here he's teaching the layman Mahanama that what he should do is be mindful, but he doesn't say like while you're walking, be aware of your stepping or something. Like while you're doing the dishes, Mahanama, you should be aware of scrubbing the dishes. No, he says while you're working, like while you're doing the dishes, you should be thinking of the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, right? So it's very different from like a secular form of mindfulness, but it is mindfulness. And this is what the Buddha said. And then we can look at other suttas. So I kind of want to just give different suttas so that you get the example, so that you kind of see how it works in real life also. So another example is actually with Mahanama again. And clearly Mahanama was following the instructions. So this sutta is in the Samyutta Nikaya, 55.21, and here's the link to that. And here we go. So this is what happens. It says, at one time, the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans near Kapilavatthu in the Banyan Tree Monastery. So same place that he was staying in the previous sutta. Then Mahanama the Sakyan went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, Sir, this Kapilavatthu, which is a city, so this Kapilavatthu is successful and prosperous, populous, full of people, with cramped cul-de-sacs. In the late afternoon, after paying homage to the Buddha or an esteemed mendicant, I enter Kapilavatthu. I encounter a stray elephant, horse, chariot, cart, or person. At that time, I lose mindfulness regarding the Buddha, the teaching, and the Sangha. I think, if I were to die at this time, where would I be reborn in my next life? Do not fear, Mahanama, do not fear, says the Buddha. Your death will not be a bad one. Your passing will not be a bad one. And then the Buddha gives a teaching to Mahanama, which again is not directly related to this topic. So you see, like, it's kind of in the corners of the suttas where, like, what is Mahanama saying here? If you look at it closely, he's saying throughout his day, he's saying he goes into the city and the city is very crowded, and sometimes he loses his mindfulness of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And then he's concerned, like, oh no, I lost my mindfulness. What if I die at this time, right? What if I'm not mindful when I die? And the Buddha says, don't be afraid. And then he gives him a teaching saying that basically, his mind has been imbued with good qualities, so he doesn't need to be afraid. But the main teaching here is what he was practicing mindfulness, right? He was practicing mindfulness, again, of these same topics that we've already talked about. He was remembering the Buddha, remembering the Dhamma, the teaching, and remembering the Sangha. And he was keeping that in his mind. And he had it in his mind somehow, but like the chaos of the city distracted him. So here he says he encounters a stray elephant. Well, I doubt that many of us are encountering one of those, but you might encounter, crazy traffic, right? That would be the equivalent of a stray elephant in modern times, or instead of a chariot or a cart, right? That would another be traffic. Or he encounters a person, right? So maybe someone comes up to you and they start talking to you, or you run into different conversations throughout your day. So the Mahanama is just saying, like, when he goes into his daily life, it's very chaotic. And sometimes he loses his mindfulness of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And again, here the word is specifically sati, right? Specifically, from the word mindfulness. let me find the Pali here. So he says, musati, musateva, which means like musati is like muddled sati. So it's like the sati has been kind of confused or muddled, for example. And so here again, we see an example, like this layperson Mahanama, what he was doing in his daily life was recollecting the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha. And then the Buddha, of course, he actually just taught that. So we just looked at a sutta where the Buddha said, you should be doing that, right? While you're working, walking, sitting, talking. Well, he doesn't say talking explicitly, but while you're doing your different postures and while you're with your children and so on, you should be developing mindfulness of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And then he also says in this sutta, talking with Mahanama, he says, that Mahanama has been practicing well, and Mahanama has been practicing mindfulness of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha in his daily life. And then you have the other cases of this. See. Yeah, you have another teaching, Anguttara Nikaya. I won't read this one in detail because it's the same message, but Anguttara Nikaya 11.13. This maybe we can edit later into the video description, but this is with Nandiya. So Nandiya would be a different person, different lay person. And there the Buddha also taught him a very similar teaching to what he gave Mahanama. But he says, in this teaching, he says, you should recollect the realized one. That's the Buddha. And then he says, the list of qualities of the Buddha. And then he says, in this way, you should establish mindfulness, sati, internally based on the realized one. And then he says the same for the Dhamma. And then he gives other teachings, which I'll talk about maybe later. So here also, this is another sutta where the Buddha is teaching a layperson, and he says that he should practice establishing mindfulness, sati, internally based off the Buddha and the Dhamma, for example. So, yeah, I think the message is quite clear, right? Like what the Buddha is recommending here is mindfulness as recollecting certain spiritual ideals, spiritual teachers, spiritual examples. And you get a really beautiful example of that with Supavasa when she was having this painful labor, where she's recollecting, like, not just the qualities of the Buddha, but she's recollecting specifically, she's going through this suffering, and she's thinking that the Buddha he became fully awakened, and he taught the Dhamma so that we can be free of the suffering that she's got, we can be free of suffering such as the type that she's going through, right? So it's like, imagine that you're going through a really hard day, and it's like, you remember, like, well, the Buddha became fully awakened, and then he became awakened and taught so that we can be free of this type of suffering. And the Dhamma exists. Like the Dhamma has been, we say svakato, it's been well taught, and it's ehipasiko. It's inviting you to come and see it, and it's pachatang vedita bovinyuhi. So it's for you to individually realize for yourself. For what? Why? To overcome this suffering, like the suffering that I'm going through right now. The Buddha taught the Dhamma, and it's been explained, it's been laid out clearly, the instructions are all there to overcome this suffering. And then the Sangha, like there have been people who have actually practiced the Dhamma taught by the Buddha, and they've realized freedom from suffering, just the same type of suffering. And there are people who are currently practicing the teachings of the Buddha so that they can become free of suffering. So it's almost like while you're going through a hard time, recollecting the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, what you're really remembering is like the hard time that you're going through. The whole point that the Buddha is, of the Buddha's existence, the whole point is to liberate people from that type of suffering. And he did teach the way out, and people have become liberated from it, including himself. So it's very alleviating, right? It's very like, if you have faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, then that's very alleviating. And you can see why she would be contemplating that in a painful experience. And then when the Buddha recommends, going throughout your day, remembering this. So it's like you're kind of orienting the mind constantly, setting the heart on a higher level. So while you're going through the world and living a life where you have busyness and distraction, you have like a part of your mind, of your heart, is kind of set on a higher ideal, right? Set on the Buddha, on the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So it's not kind of lost in the world, but it's able to be lifted up and elevated to kind of a spiritual sense of relief and sense of faith and sense of direction of like what is really important here, what to really prioritize, right? So say you go through, you see something in your daily life, and maybe someone's talking to you, and say that they, say something that is not very polite, or they act in a way that's not very appropriate, right? Well, you could get angry at it, but if you're remembering, like, oh, the Buddha was this awakened being who was not angry, and he was compassionate, and the Dhamma, he clearly taught the Dhamma, which points out, for example, the drawbacks of anger. And the Sangha, there are people who have realized they've become free of anger, and they're practicing now to be free of it. So when you have your mind remembering that, it's like it doesn't really matter, right? These small daily counters, these daily occurrences, become like much less important, because your mind is established on something much more relevant, much more spiritually valuable. So you're kind of setting your priorities, right? And it's like an internal compass of, like, internally, you're putting the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha as the kind of backdrop to everything that's going around you. And then those other things, they become easier to manage, easier to relate to, and they also become contextualized, and they turn into spiritual practice. So that's the kind of mindfulness that the Buddha is teaching here. And I think it's obvious why that would not be, of course, taught in like a secular therapy or something, because if you don't have faith in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, well, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Why would you think about that? And it would be similar to saying, well, just remember Jesus. Well, if you're not a Christian, that might not be particularly helpful. But if you are one, right, if you are a Christian, then that would be helpful, right? And in fact, that is a Christian practice. And the word mindfulness, this is where we also get into the history of the word mindfulness, which is very interesting. The word mindfulness in English, from what I've heard, what I've been told, and I believe that this is the case, the word mindfulness in English originally actually refers to constantly remembering God. So constantly being mindful of God. So in a religious context, like as you're going throughout your day, if you're a Christian, right, as you're going throughout your day, you remember the presence of God, not to get too bogged down into the Christian, say, doctrine, but like, for example, the fact that if Christ has died for you, that your sins can be saved, that you have the opportunity of salvation from your sins, and that the world is being kind of redeemed, and so on. So certain memory of Christian doctrine, basically, in the presence of God and the love of God and these types of things. And that's supposed to then kind of color your day and color your interactions. So mindfulness of God, this is a very prominent Christian practice. And in Italian, you might say the word like ricordo, which literally means memory, but it means like to remember constantly the presence of God, or the reality of God, or something like that, right? So the word mindfulness, it also has that sense of like remembering something, and it can even be used in a spiritual context. And that's exactly what the Buddha is using it for. Just rather than God, he's recommending that you recollect the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, which are the spiritual compasses, so to speak, of Buddhism, right? Rather than, say, a kind of supreme deity, or Jesus Christ, or Krishna, or Muhammad, or any other kind of figure, right? You're remembering the teachings, the community of practitioners, and the fact that the Buddha became awakened, and the qualities of the Buddha. So this is what the Buddha is saying, and we can see that it makes a lot of sense. Like, okay, other religious traditions and spiritual traditions have that practice, and the Buddha had that practice, and that's precisely what mindfulness is really referring to. Now, it's not just Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, though. So this is one that we see kind of throughout the suttas. We see there's an emphasis on Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and I kind of have given some explanation of that. And I think we have a nice example of that with Supavasa. So we see examples of why Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, right? Another example on this topic is just in the same kind of thread of what I've been saying, is that when we remember the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, if we have faith in them, which is how the Buddha starts some of the teaching, right? Saying faith is how people who have faith, they succeed, right? So if you don't have faith, then it wouldn't make any sense to repeat that point. So it's kind of coming from this assumption that you have some faith in these things, right? And when you have that faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, then it's also a question of moving the faith from other things, right? Like if you put faith in the world, well, you might be very quickly disappointed. Like if you have faith in the government, say, and then the government does something that you don't approve of, or that you find disappointing, then you've lost that source of faith, that thing that you were relying upon, trusting in. You lose it, right? So this is in the topic of refuge, where the Buddha talks about taking refuge. So we say, Buddhang saranang gacchami, I go to the Buddha for refuge. Dhammang saranang gacchami, I go to the Dhamma for refuge. Sanghang saranang gacchami, I go to the Sangha for refuge. So this is what the Buddha says. We go that he, to do is going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And what does refuge mean? I think this is just a really valuable point to consider. It's a very fruitful point for our practice. Like, to just think about refuge. What does that mean? Refuge is a place of safety. So it's like if there's war around you, if there's violence around you, if there's distraction around you and you need a place of safety or of peace, or if you're hungry, you can go to a place to be fed. If you are cold, you can go to a place to be clothed. If you're tired, you can go to a place to rest and sleep, right? So refuge is like a place where you can go that will give you shelter and protection and nourishment in a world where you will be denied those things, or you will be struggling against those forces which kind of take those things away from you, right? So we go to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha for refuge, like for this nourishment and this shelter and this peace and this safety. And there's a famous series of verses in the Dhammapada where the Buddha says people go to refuge to, shrines in nature and mountains and so on, but those refuges aren't actually going to lead you out of suffering. But when you go to refuge in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, then you will develop the wisdom and to liberate yourself to be free of suffering. So the supreme refuge, the highest refuge, are the refuges in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, because they actually lead to a sense of ultimate safety, right? To ultimate peace and shelter. And some of the epithets for Nibbana, the goal of Buddhist practice, are words like shelter, safety, security. A famous one in Pali is yoga kema. Yoga is the yoke, right? Many people know the word yoga, but in this case, yoga is the yoke, like what you tie an animal, you put on an animal when it's pulling a cart. And yoga kema is like a place of rest, a sanctuary, a safe place. And it's when you take the yoke off of the animals and you let them rest and you stop working and you just take a break, right? So it's that place of rest, of peace, of safety, of shelter. And that is what, when we go to the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha for refuge for, that's what we're thinking about, right? That's the intention. So when you're remembering Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, you're basically changing the direction of the mind. You're placing your faith on something that will actually lead you to safety. Whereas our general tendency, our general habit is to place our faith in other things. Like, even if we intellectually think, oh, I have faith in the Buddha or whatever, well, faith is not just an intellectual assent, right? And this is related to the Pali word faith. The Pali word faith, saddha. Sad in this place means heart, and dha means like, in this context, you could say it almost means like placing. So it means the placing of the heart, like you place your heart on something, right? Or another way you could almost think about it as a sort of as an image is like where you rest your head, right? You might rest your head on someone's shoulder or on someone's chest, right? So you rest your heart on something, and that's what you put faith in. We also call it trust, right? You trust someone. And so like trusting someone means you have faith in them, right? And if someone is not faithful to you, then it means that they kind of broke your trust, right? They didn't, you were relying on them for something, but they weren't able to sustain that trust. So the idea of trust and faith, like they're very intimately related. And where do we place our faith? So it's not just an intellectual assent, because just because you agree to something doesn't mean that that's where you're actually placing your heart, that that's what you're actually trusting in on an emotional level, on a kind of experiential, practical level, right? So what we're actually trusting in, that's what we really place our faith in. And so when we recollect the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, it's like a reminder, right? It's reminding us that we cannot trust other things, right? We cannot trust outside people. We cannot trust the world or the government. We can't trust, that the environment is going to be a safe place. We can't trust that we're always going to have good health, or that we're going to have live a long life, or that we're going to always have our friends and family around us. Like, we can't trust any of those things, but we can trust the Buddha, that he was awakened and that he taught the way out of suffering. You can trust the Dhamma, that there is a teaching and a practice that is well explained, that you can go to and that you can experience in your own life to transform that suffering and be liberated from it. And then there is a community of disciples who have realized and are practicing to realize the reality of those teachings in their hearts. So those are things that the Buddha is saying, if you trust in those things, those will give you refuge. Those will lead to safety and shelter and peace. And so that is something that's really powerful, right? That's why being mindful of those things is so helpful in a case like, well, in just daily life, and also in a case of extreme suffering and pain, like we saw with Suppamasa. And then there are other themes. So I mentioned before, the Buddha also talked about recollecting your own virtue, right? So you can trust in that fact. Like if you've been a virtuous person, even if you just have the intention to practice virtue, to say, well, I've done some things that I'm not proud of. I've done some things that I wish I did differently. I haven't been the most kind. I haven't been the most selfless. I haven't been the most generous. I haven't been the most clear-minded. But now I'm making a commitment that I do want to act more kindly. I do want to act more selflessly, more generously, more clear-mindedly, less greed, less hatred, less delusion, more contentment, more love and kindness, more wisdom, right? So all of those intentions there, that is virtue. So that's the mind turning to virtue and recollecting that. Like right now you can do that, right? So the reason I say that is that sometimes people get stuck on like how kind of remembering virtuous deeds. So it's something that you have to build up the habit of doing. Like you have to start focusing on those deeds. But that's a reality. Like right now, right here and now, there is that reality, and that can be trusted on. You can trust on that virtue in your heart, in your life, and in the past actions that you've done. And one of the ways that I recommend doing this, I highly recommend it, is that at the end of every day, at least, but at the end of every day, before you go to bed, ideally, ideally it would be like a little bit when you're still clear-minded, right? Sit down, close your eyes, calm your mind a little bit, and then remember all the good things that you did during the day. So just anything. So even like you smiled at someone, you gave something to someone, you shared your time with someone, you were patient, you wanted to get angry, but you reflected, that you shouldn't. You wanted to be greedy and kind of go after something that you shouldn't, but you restrained yourself. You studied some suttas, you did some meditation, you listened to a Dhamma talk, you helped a friend, you were hospitable, whatever it is, like you cooked dinner for your family, like anything generous that you've done, anything virtuous that you've done, including I tried to follow the 5 precepts today. I tried to follow the 8 precepts today. I tried to follow whatever precepts that you're taking. Like even just the commitment to follow certain precepts, even just the commitment to be virtuous in general. Like even if you haven't taken specific precepts, do you want to be generally a better person, right? So even that is a virtuous deed. So recollecting that at the end of the day and kind of bathing the mind, like bathing your conscience. It's almost like you're taking off the dirt and you're kind of washing and cleansing and putting like oils and perfumes on your mind to cleanse it with all these virtuous deeds. And that is actually something that the Buddha says you can remember that in confidence, that is actually going to be leading you onward in the Dhamma, right? That is a reality that you can rely upon, because virtue, as the suttas say, is something that cannot be stolen from you, right? So your possessions can be stolen, your house can be burnt down, your country can be plundered, but your virtue cannot be taken away from you. No one can take away that virtue. It can't be done. So once it's been done, it's been created. It's like, it doesn't matter. And I have a story of this where it's not a very dramatic story, but it's something that we might be able to relate to. I remember maybe it was last year or something like that. We did a bunch of work with a bunch of volunteers and friends, and we cleared away all these weeds. And we made this flat kind of surface to be able to meet in the forest monastery here in Italy. And then I think it was the next year we came and we saw, like, after the rain and the winter and the spring and so on, the rain came and the weeds and the grass and everything was just flowing up, and it was really all the work was completely undone. And the whole area that we had worked to clear was completely filled with weeds and grass all over again, right? So it was like all that work was for naught, so to speak. So the work, like all that work, all that physical labor was totally lost. But the intention, the volunteering, like the generosity, the time that people took to help clear those weeds, the generosity that was offered, that was not lost, right? Like the physical work was gone, but all the good karma, all the good kamma that was made through that service, that remains, that cannot be taken away. So even if the weeds grow back again, the good kamma has been made. It cannot be stolen. So that's something to remember. Like you might think, oh, I spent my whole life doing this thing for my family, and then now, it's going away. It's being, it's not working out anymore. Well, all that work that you did, that remains. Like that's actually the important part, not the material success of the work that you do. What matters is, were you coming from a good intention? Were you storing up good kamma? Were you storing up punya, good merits? When you store that up, that cannot be taken away. So recollecting the virtue, recollecting the generosity, that's something that we can actually rely upon. And that mindfulness is something that can protect us. So, for example, when we're dying, when we're sick, when we are suffering, when a loved one is dying or suffering, when we remember our virtue and our generosity, or we remind them of their virtue and their generosity, that actually helps them get through it. That's like real mindfulness, with chronic pain or with sickness in the hospital, right? That kind of mindfulness is very powerful, and it's something that we should not neglect, because sometimes in the modern world, because of a whole series of complicated historical reasons, like we think that moral and ethical actions and like science and objective data, these are like separate domains. Like morality is religion, and then science is like something separate. And so we need to be secular, we need to be non-religious, we need to be friendly to everyone, whether you have a religion or you don't have a religion. Everyone needs to be included. So we can't talk about morality, we can't talk about ethics, we can't talk about following precepts because that's religious. Well, the reality is that ethics, morality is it's a fact of human experience. Like, it's not a religious thing, right? It doesn't matter if you're Christian or if you're Buddhist or whatever. Everyone makes ethical choices. So either you're doing good things that are based on greed, hatred, or delusion, or you're doing things that are based on non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. It doesn't matter what religion you are. That's a universal fact. Everyone is making choices, and those choices have a certain dimension to them of greed, hatred, and delusion. Whatever your theory of ethics, whatever your theory of morality is, like, that's kind of a secondary point. But the point that the Buddha is making is, like, whatever your theories and your beliefs and your religions are, your choices clearly have an effect on your life. Like, whatever you believe about them, that doesn't really matter. Your choices have an effect on your conscience and on your life and on your well-being. That is an observable fact. Just like you can observe, psychological or scientific things in the natural world, you can observe that our ethical choices have an effect on us. And so why am I making that point? The reason I'm making this point is that mindfulness practices, which don't include like this quality of remembering the good deeds that we do and uplifting the heart and having faith in the power of virtue, that at the end of the day, we might not be able to have the physical results of our work, but we can always remember and rely on our virtue and be mindful of that virtue and that goodness and that generosity. That's something that I think we should be more more tolerant of, right? More accepting. Like, no, this is not something to be kind of dismissed as religious or not accessible to everyone. It is accessible to everyone. Like, you can just remember the good deeds you've done, and everyone will become uplifted because of that, pretty much. So that's another form of mindfulness that the Buddha recommended. And then also in this sutta with Nandya, the Buddha says, you should recollect your good friends. And the Buddha, the way he words this, he says, you should think, I'm fortunate, so very fortunate, to have good friends who advise and instruct me out of kindness and sympathy. In this way, you should establish mindfulness internally based on good friends. So that's an interesting one, right? We talk about recollecting the Sangha, but another way of thinking about it in maybe slightly different practice but related is recollecting your spiritual friends. Like thinking, oh, I'm so fortunate to have people around me who want to help me spiritually and who encourage me spiritually. Like, oh, that's so amazing. That's a mindfulness practice. The Buddha calls that mindfulness, sati. So recollecting the people in our lives who have helped us and helped us grow and mature spiritually is another mindfulness practice, which uplifts the mind. And you'll notice here that the Buddha said in the other suttas that actually by recollecting things like Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, your virtue, your generosity, by doing that, it's actually a meditation practice. Like, it's a formal meditation practice that can lead you into samadhi and lead you into all the way down to the end of the Noble Eightfold Path. So it's like, we're not just talking about a basic practice here. It's something that the Buddha recommended to lay people to do throughout their day, but he also recommends it to lay people as a formal meditation practice to develop the whole Eightfold Path, basically. So those are certain aspects of mindfulness. And the Buddha did teach elsewhere. He taught recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha quite famously. It's a relatively well-known practice. He said, for example, if you have fear, like he said to the monks, if you're out in the wilderness and you have fear, just remember me, remember the Buddha, remember the Dhamma and the Sangha, and that will dispel your fear. So also for things like fear, right? And then he also talked about mindfulness of death. So mindfulness of death is like remembering the reality of death, remembering that we might die. Again, that's not a religious thing because everyone has to die, whatever you believe. And so this teaching of remembering death, that's another mindfulness practice that the Buddha taught to do constantly. And we don't have per se time to go through all that, but I have some suttas that I can, again, put probably in the description after this, where the Buddha says that, he says, as day passes by and night draws close, a mendicant reflects, I might die of many causes. A snake might bite me, or a scorpion or centipede might sting me, or if I died from that, and if I died from that, it would be an obstacle to me, or I might stumble off a cliff or get food poisoning or suffer a disturbance of bile, phlegm, or piercing winds, and if I died from that, it would be an obstacle to my progress. That mendicant should reflect, are there any bad, unskillful qualities that I haven't given up, which might be an obstacle to my progress if I die tonight? And then he talks about, practicing and so on. So here, again, you have the idea of like remembering, reflecting on the fact that we might die. And so thinking, well, is there anything that I, should develop in my heart before I die? Like if I might die tonight, is there something that I should work on developing? And then he also talks about recollecting death in a more constant manner, like not just like at a certain point during the day, but he also talks about suttas where monks should recollect death very, very frequently, like almost constantly remembering that they might die. And that's another mindfulness practice, right? Very relevant, very, very powerful. And this is also interesting to note on this point, because we have things like, okay, mindfulness of death, and then mindfulness of the good things that you've done in the past, right? So another common idea about mindfulness is like, well, mindfulness is non-judgmental present moment awareness, right? Being aware of the present moment. Like I said before, like while you're washing the dishes, don't think of the past, don't think of the future, just be aware of washing the dishes. But, well, hopefully when you're mindful of death, that's not happening right now, right? That's not present moment. That's something that you're not dying right now, per se. You will die. You're thinking that you will die in the future. And when you're recollecting your past generosity, your past good deeds, like you're thinking of the past, actually. You're recollecting the past. And the Buddha specifically said that that is mindfulness that should be developed. So that's another interesting thing, right? So sometimes mindfulness is limited to, mindfulness is just present moment awareness. Well, remembering your past deeds, that's from the past. Remembering that you're going to die in the future, that's in the future. And remembering, for example, the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, that's kind of not really either present, past, or future, right? Because it's sort of like generally, sort of general principle, like the Dhamma is well taught. It's not really it's not the present moment in the sense of like, it's not a sensation that's happening in the present moment, but it's also not in the past or in the future per se. So it's kind of just like a general quality. So mindfulness is not just present moment awareness, right? As the Buddha taught it. And especially even everyday life, like even mindfulness while walking, while working, while being at home and so on, the Buddha said you should do these things. And that's not just present moment. So even while you're working, the Buddha is saying, hey, it's not just present moment awareness. Like be aware of your good deeds, even while you're working. Well, that would mean remembering, for example, it could involve remembering the past, right? So it doesn't exclude present moment awareness. And again, I'm not saying that present moment awareness is wrong. That's very relevant, right? That's very important. To also be aware of the present moment is also a part of Buddhism. But it is not the only thing about mindfulness. And it's not what the Buddha said about what should mindfulness, in daily life and everyday life, what does that mean? It's not just present moment awareness at all, for sure. Because he explicitly teaches the exact opposite of that. Well, not the opposite, but he teaches things that include the opposite of that. So these are all just examples. I know that it's kind of a bit, complicated, and I've gone through many different suttas, and it's, it's not prepared or anything, but I hope it's just giving you a general idea and giving you some suttas to look into on your own time and to think about how mindfulness is something a bit more broad, how it's something that the Buddha did teach to practice in everyday life, and how lay people in the time of the Buddha, they were practicing in everyday life. Like that's, like I said, so inspiring, right? Supavasa, she's going through this painful childbirth, and she's remembering the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and also remembering Nibbana. And Mahanama, right, remembering it while he's out, going, he thinking, he loses his mindfulness when he's in the city of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So these lay people who are thinking about mindfulness in daily life, and they're doing it in a way that's kind of showing us, right, what were they doing? Well, they're mindful of the Buddha, mindful of the Dhamma, mindful of the Sangha, and mindful of other things as well. And it's interesting to note, like I said, that at no point, the Buddha doesn't say, he never teaches here mindfulness of the present moment, right? None of the suttas that we looked at today are about the present moment. Of course, mindfulness of your good deeds, that could involve the present moment, right? Be mindful of the virtue in the present. That's fine, and that's relevant, or generosity and so on. But actually, he never said be mindful while you're, be mindful of the present moment in the very strict sense of that phrase. So clearly it's not necessary, right? Clearly it's not something that the Buddha felt was super important, like only this is true, everything else is wrong. And so that's, again, just very thought-provoking, right? Very something to kind of reflect and see how can we integrate that into our lives if we want to follow these examples. And I do want to close by saying that there is a teaching in the suttas called developing sampajanya. And that is basically equivalent to when we talk about like mindfulness in everyday life, when we talk about being mindful in the present moment, being mindful throughout the day, the Buddha doesn't actually, he does teach that in a kind of, he does sort of teach that, but he generally uses a different word for it. So he uses the word sampajanya. Sampajanya means something like awareness, or can even be something like self-awareness or full awareness. Sometimes it's translated as situational awareness, but fundamentally it means something like awareness, in the sense of being aware of what's going on. And I think we can understand, like, oh yeah, being aware of what's going on, right? That's what we're talking about. So present moment awareness, right? So awareness in Pali, sampajanya, that's really the word that the Buddha uses for, like he says, for example, while you're walking and while you're extending your limbs, you should have sampajanya, you should have awareness. So it's like, okay, when you're moving your arms and when you're going around and putting on your clothes and so on, he talks about having sampajanya. And that would be another topic for another day, because it's not necessarily just being aware, right? As we know, you can be aware while you're, robbing a bank, and that doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? You can be, I know a burglar can be very aware while they're walking through the house to make sure that no one hears them, very slowly, mindfully stepping. Or, you can have someone who's guarding a store, and they see the robbers coming in, and they're very aware, they're very mindful that the robbers are coming in, and they're very mindful that the robbers are leaving with all the goods. But mindfulness, clearly that's not an example of a good form of mindfulness, right? So being aware in and of itself is clearly not enough, right? Because just being aware, you can be aware while you're doing anything. So awareness itself is not per se like the kind of point that's going on here. But the Buddha does teach awareness in daily activities. The reason I'm saying this is that the Buddha does teach that. And usually it's understood, okay, he's saying be aware of it while you're aware also of the purpose of it. Do it where you're kind of aware of what you're doing, not just in the sense of that you're doing it, but you're aware also of the kind of implications of what you're doing to a certain extent, right? So like, let's say that you're opening a door and people are sleeping. Well, you do it, be aware of what you're doing. So do it quietly if you don't want to wake them up, for example. So be developing this awareness of our actions, that is definitely part of the Buddha's teachings. And so I don't want to downplay that. And I want to kind of emphasize that again, because I don't want people to take away from this like, oh, you should never be aware in the present moment. That would be definitely the wrong teaching to take away from what I'm saying. But rather my point is that the word that we translate as mindfulness actually involves a diversity of things, including in daily life. And those things are often a bit more subtle, more spiritual, and a bit more transcendental, basically. More transcendental and more kind of to the point of the Buddhist goal, rather than just present moment awareness of sensations, for example. So yeah, those are some thoughts on mindfulness for everyday life. And I hope that that's been helpful. I hope that it gives you some food for thought. And at this point, I'll take a look at some of the questions, and feel free again to ask any other questions that you might have about this. And we can see how it goes from there. So hello also to the people who have joined in during the talk while I was going on that I didn't address. See lots of people joining in and some people watching. And so I appreciate you all being interested in the Dhamma, being mindful of the Dhamma. And let's see, we have one question here that I addressed, but Sahil Gadpal says, where are you from? I'm from the US, but I am staying in Italy right now. And asking about Jataka Kata, I think that would be not directly on topic, so I won't address that right now. And then we have a question from Samana Carol, who says, how are moments of mindfulness interrelated with kusala chitta? Good. So this is a good question. I hope that this has been somewhat answered by the talk, in that, because this was from a bit earlier, where I talked about how mindfulness develops these wholesome states, right? So like mindfulness of the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, they are encouraging us to develop kusala, chitta. For those who don't know, that means a wholesome mind state. So developing a mind state which is beneficial and which is makes us happy and increases our spiritual practice, and is something that's based off of wholesome qualities, skillful spiritual qualities. So when we're mindful of the Buddha, Dhamma, and the Sangha, kind of the whole point of it is to turn the mind to the wholesome. And actually recollecting the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha is in and of itself a wholesome act, usually. If you're doing it intentionally, with meaning, with faith, it is in and of itself a wholesome act, because you're cleansing the mind of unwholesome states by that recollection, and you're developing wholesome states. And as the Buddha said, mindfulness of the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, mindfulness of your virtue, of your generosity, mindfulness of the devas and so on, that actually develops, it's a cause for developing wholesome dhammas like samadhi, which is very wholesome, and wholesome dhammas like the qualities that lead to samadhi. So I didn't go into it in detail, but the Buddha talked about how by recollecting, say, the Buddha, then you can gain inspiration, and then you can gain gladness, and then rapture and tranquility and bliss and samadhi and so on. So, and that can eventually then lead to wisdom. That leads to wisdom. So all of those wholesome dhammas, all of those wholesome states, qualities, they start with mindfulness, right? In a way. So often they start with mindfulness. And also mindfulness can inspire developing them, because as I mentioned one sutta here, where the Buddha says, when you're mindful of death, then you think, oh, are there other wholesome qualities that I should develop? Are there other kusala, wholesome states that I should develop because I might die? So mindfulness in these ways, it encourages us to turn to the wholesome, and it also in and of itself often is actually wholesome and leads to wholesome dhammas. So I hope that that's helpful. And then we have a question from Mano. Hello. It says, I'm interested in understanding more clearly how to have faithfulness in the Dhamma. Also, I suppose this would be what counters the hindrance of doubt. Great, yeah. So as the Buddha said to Mahanama and Nandya, he said, right, the first thing he said was, those with faith succeed. And so the Buddha clearly praised this quality of faith, saddha. But it is a question, right? If you say, well, just have faith, often people say, well, I can't just do that, right? I can't just have faith, because usually something that either if you're doubting, for example, you can't just kind of remove the doubt by saying, well, just have faith, right? So sometimes that might work for some people, but often that's not really the most useful way of relating to it, because we kind of expect ourselves to do something that we might just not, at those conditions, we just can't do that. So we don't need to expect that. That's not I guess what I'm saying is the Buddha is not expecting us to just kind of create faith out of nothing. That's not what he's saying, right? So yeah, it's a good question, because it's precisely like, how do we have it, right? How do we actually get it? And that's a good question. And there are a couple different things. So one of the things is faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha comes from studying, practicing the teachings. So when you practice the teachings, then you start to see the reality of some of those teachings in your life. And that leads to having more faith in the Buddha, because the Buddha taught them. So a classic example is the doctor, right? And sometimes the Buddha is traditionally compared to a doctor. And so if a doctor gives you medicine, well, you have to have faith in the doctor, and you have to have faith in the medicine, right? So they're kind of two separate things. Like the doctor, that they're giving you the right medicine, that they're giving you the right amount, that they're prescribing the right thing, and that they want to cure you and they want to help you, and they're not trying to harm you. So faith in the doctor, like in their knowledge and in their compassion. And then also faith in the medicine, that the medicine itself is going to work, right? Because maybe the doctor is very knowledgeable and very compassionate, but maybe the medicine you don't trust. Or theoretically, you might trust certain medicines, but you don't trust certain doctors, right? So in the practice of the Dhamma, like the doctor and the medicine go together, because the Buddha is saying, here's the medicine, it's the Dhamma, right? So he's giving the teachings, and he's saying, this is the medicine, this can cure the mind of affliction and stress. This can cure and heal and transform and be liberating. So the Dhamma is the medicine. And so when you take the medicine gradually and you start to experience bits of the effectiveness of the medicine and how it works in your life and transforms it and liberates you from certain things, or at least moves in that direction, then you start to gain faith in the doctor, because this medicine is coming from a doctor. The medicine that you have is coming from a doctor that gave it to you. So you start to trust the medicine and you start to trust the doctor. And then you also start to trust that other people who took the same medicine from the same doctor, they also will experience results, right? Like if it worked for you, then it will work for others as well, basically. Once you understand how it's universal, like if you understand, just for example, say that you start to develop metta, and you start to develop wisdom, and you start to develop an understanding of life and people and the mind. And so your things like anger and fear start to go down. So then you start to understand, okay, the Dhamma has cured the mind of certain things, or it's worked and transformed the mind of certain things, maybe. And so then you gain faith in the Buddha, you gain faith in the teaching, and because you know that it works to that extent, you start to gain faith also in the Sangha, the disciples of the Buddha, and you're becoming one of the Sangha. You're becoming one of the disciples of the Buddha. And so the faith in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, it comes from practice, and it also comes from study. Because when you read the interactions that the Buddha had in the suttas, when you read how the Buddha interacted with people, and when you read how the Buddha taught people, then you start to get a sense of who the Buddha was as a person, like who he actually was as a human being, right? Because the Buddha was a person, so he was an actual living being. And when you gain faith in that by learning more about him, it gives you another type of faith, right? Because you can practice the Dhamma, but that doesn't necessarily tell you like who the Buddha was as a person. So sometimes people struggle because they might have, like I've heard people say that, they have an easier time gaining faith in the Dhamma, but for faith in the Buddha, it's a bit harder because, maybe it's just a bit harder to relate to, like who exactly was the Buddha. So maybe abstractly, like he taught the Dhamma, but it's harder to kind of gain that faith in him as a teacher, right? And of course, it doesn't need to be forced, because it just naturally it'll grow over time. But one way to help develop that is to read about the Buddha, right? Because you read about in the suttas, you read about what he did and what he said. So not just his teachings, but actually how he taught them and how he related to people and his actions and so on. And that can be very inspiring, right? So that's another way of gaining faith in the Buddha. So it's through reading, it's through reflecting, and it's through practicing. And above all, it's through experiencing the results in your own life, right? That's what actually, really, that's the ultimate thing. And it's also important to understand that until a certain level of maturity in the Dhamma, there will just naturally be doubts, because doubt is one of what the Buddha called three fetters, right? Three of the lower fetters. So the point that the Buddha makes in the suttas is that people will have doubt until they gain a certain level of realization of the Dhamma, like until they gain a very penetrating, full, clear realization of the Dhamma, then they will have some doubts because they haven't realized it for themselves. Like the Buddha is never expecting someone to have perfect faith just by belief alone. And in fact, the Buddha kind of, in a way, he kind of discouraged that. Like he never discourages faith in the Buddha, but he discourages jumping to conclusions just based off faith alone. So the Buddha is not asking anyone to like force themselves to jump to a conclusion. But he's saying that eventually someone will be established in very firm faith, right? When they become a sotapanna, when they become a stream enterer. So once they realize the Dhamma on a very deep level, then they will gain very firm, unshakable, strong faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And so until that point, you should just expect, like you're not going to have that level of faith, right? It's just not going to happen, because it only happens when certain causes come into being, right? When this exists, then this comes into being. If this does not exist, then this does not come into being. That's a classic statement on the nature of conditionality and causes in the Buddhist teaching. So just understand, like if there's not a certain level of understanding, if there's not a certain depth of practice, then the faith will also not be to that same level of depth. But that's not a problem, and that's nothing to be ashamed of or anything like that. It's just natural. It's just nature. It's like if a tree is growing, it's not yet fully grown yet. So we shouldn't expect like a sapling to be the height of a 100-year-old tree, right? But there's nothing wrong with saplings, and every tree starts out as a sapling, right? No one starts out as a fully grown tree. So that's one thing to keep in mind with doubt and faith. Like, it grows over time, and it's something that the Buddha was well aware of that fact. He was never expecting it to be otherwise. And yeah, in terms of countering the hindrance of doubt, faith can be one way of countering the hindrance of doubt, but it's not the only way. Because another way, that's, as I mentioned, like, it's definitely the hindrance of doubt is only overcome when someone has grounded faith. Like, they would go together. But other ways of countering the hindrance of doubt are also like noticing if the doubt is not actually helpful, and if it's kind of just based off of a sort of anxiety that is not going to be resolved through thinking, right? So sometimes doubt, you have to kind of see, like, the image that I give of this is, imagine that, sometimes with children, right? You take have a hand and you say, what's in my hand? Do you want to guess what's in my hand? What's in here? But you don't actually have anything in your hand. But you're like, oh, what's in there? Come on, guess what is it? And like, you might even have a certain level of, like, you can guess, okay, it must be smaller than your hand, so I'm going to try to figure it out. And like, I'll keep guessing and guessing and guessing. And like, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And you can go that for a long, long time. You can do that your whole life, because there's potentially infinite things that could be in this hand. But the point is that there's nothing in there. Like, and I'm never going to show you. It's just a game to get you to start, to trick you. It's just a game to make you kind of wonder. It's just to get you to be curious. So often doubt is like that. Like, it's just the mind. It doesn't actually have an answer. You can't actually get an answer by thinking about it. The answer will come about through something else, not by thinking. And so it's like you're trying to guess at what's inside the hand, but you won't find out by guessing, right? And so that's another important thing to understand. Like, sometimes doubt. It's not that it's resolved by like faith, but sometimes it's resolved by just saying, I don't have faith in this at this time. Or it's resolved by saying, like, I don't know, right? Or it's resolved by saying, well, I can't find this out yet, so I'll have to practice, XYZ to be able to find out. So sometimes that's how you do it. And that is a kind of faith, but it's not exactly the same type of like inspiration and sort of joy and devotion that you might feel towards someone that you respect and love. It's a little bit of a different type of faith. It's more like just trust in the process, right? And yeah, that is very important as well. Like, you have to have some faith in the process and be like, well, it's possible, or it might be possible, but right now I can't figure that out. So sometimes it takes that type of honesty with oneself about like just the limitations of our current abilities, and to say, well, we just have to wait and just trust in the process. So yeah, that's another form of faith that is also useful for doubt. Okay, and then we have looks like a question from Nok Noi. Hello, Nok Noi. Says, okay, how can we train the mind to not jump around like the monkey mind? How can we train the mind to steady, full with sati and samadhi and not get pulled around? How can we do something with growing up from inside the mind, and how we can put it down, that growing not spread outside by speech and action from unwholesome? My question is how I can train my mind to steady, not shakeable, the thing that's shakeable with the things that are growing or touching. Okay, a good question, Noknoi, about sati, controlling the mind, where we talk about sometimes the monkey mind and how the mind goes here and goes there. And then, like you said, sometimes maybe you have greed, like lobha in the mind, or anger, dosa in the mind. And then that can turn into speech, or it can turn into an action, right? So we want to, at the very best, we want to limit the unwholesome things to just being in the mind, right? We don't want to let them spill out into the speech and the actions. And that does require mindfulness. And there was actually another sutta about mindfulness that is related to this that I didn't talk about, but maybe because you asked the question, I can talk about it. And that's, I'll put it here, Anguttara Nikaya 4.117. And in this sutta, the Buddha says, you should practice diligence, mindfulness, and guarding the mind by thinking, may my mind not be aroused by things that arouse greed. And also, may my mind not be angered by things that provoke hate. May my mind not be deluded by things that promote delusion. And may my mind not be intoxicated by things that intoxicate. He says, in your own way, you should practice diligence, mindfulness, and guarding of the mind. So here the Buddha is saying that mindfulness is like you're mindful with the intention, may I not get angry at things that make me angry. May I not get a lot of desire for things that cause desire in me. And may I not be confused by things that confuse me, and so on. So also mindfulness. And what you do is you remember, like, if you're angry, remember, I might say something wrong. So I need to be very careful. I need to be very watchful, be very attentive. And if you're greedy and you're going to say something or do something, you be very careful. You watch the mind, and you remember, mindfulness being remembering, you remember that the consequences of speaking and acting and even thinking intentional, angry, greedy, or deluded things, that those consequences are harmful, that they cause suffering for ourselves and for others. So you remember the consequences, and you remember the drawbacks, and you remember the problems with doing bad things. And then that stops you, that kind of helps prevent you. Because usually we only do bad things, and we do things that we regret because in the moment we think it's a good idea, right? So like in the moment we think, well, yeah, it's not the best, but I should do it anyway. Or, I deserve to do this, or this is what's right now. I need to do this. So in the moment we get deluded and we think that it's the right thing to do. So when we need to have mindfulness and just remember, no, this is, acting out of greed, acting out of hate, acting out of delusion, these are not good things. These cause suffering for myself. This will lead to bad habits and bad states of mind, and it will lead to my suffering, and it will lead to other suffering, and it will lead to bad relationships with others. So you remember those things, and you have patience, right? You have patience because it's not going to be instant. You have to do it slowly, step by step, over time. And that slow step-by-step progress, as it says in the Dhammapada, a wise person slowly, step by step, they purify their stains. So you slowly, step by step, purify the mind, slowly developing more mindfulness to be aware. And you do that by, develop dana, generosity, develop sila, take the precepts and reflect on your actions, right? And try to do better and better. And remember the good actions that you do. And then develop bhavana, develop meditation, where you train the mind so that you have more awareness, more self-control, and you also have less anger and less greed in your mind. So it's a very broad question because you're basically asking how to practice Buddhism. But those are some examples you in this context, and remember Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, right? So like if you're thinking something and you're going to say something bad, remember the Buddha. Would the Buddha do that? Remember the Sangha? Would Ananda do that? Would Mahapajapati do that? Would Patachara do that? Would Sariputta do that? Would Mahamoggallana do that? No, they wouldn't do that, right? So the Buddha would never do things that were greedy, angry, or deluded. And the fully enlightened disciples, they would never do that. So, and the Dhamma, does it teach us to do that? No, it doesn't. It teaches us to do the opposite. So when you remember the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, it's like, it's kind of shining a light on our delusion and saying like, whoa, this is, if we think that we're right by doing something wrong, it's like, well, no, actually we're being reminded that that's not true. So we remember the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and then we remember like, the Buddha taught us how to get over this. This is normal. The Buddha knew this. The Buddha, he suffered, he was also suffered from defilements before he became enlightened. So the Buddha was aware of this and he overcame it. And he taught the Dhamma, and the Sangha has practiced and is practicing well. So, it gives you that faith, that joy. So remember Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, right? Mindfulness of these things. So those are all examples of, by using mindfulness, we train our mind to kind of get past where our blind spots, and also to develop a stronger sense of connection and participation in the wider kind of reality of the triple gem, right? Like not just the Buddha as an idea, but kind of participating in the example of the Buddha, and the Dhamma as like something that's acting and transforming our lives, and the Sangha as something that we can start to grow more and more near to. So those are some examples. And at this point, I have gone over time. So I hope that this was beneficial to all of you. And I, again, would like to thank all of you for your attention, whether you're watching this live or you're watching this later. And so I'm wishing you all a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week and practice, wherever that may be and whenever that may be. So at this time, we can close with 3 sadhus in respect for the Buddha's teaching that I've been trying to share with you, represent, and then we can go ahead and close. Sadhu. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a good rest of your day.